Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Baker Institute. It is great to have so many of you with us today. So I'm Jim Crane. I'm the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies here at the Institute. And today we are going to talk about Saudi Arabia. It's an absolute monarchy that is important to just about everybody on the planet, but particularly those of us who live here in Houston. So decisions made in Riyadh can affect Houstonians directly, and as we've seen recently, almost immediately sometimes. So that makes our relationship with Saudi Arabia maybe a little bit different than for the rest of the United States. Here, we view the kingdom sort of in part as a partner. We've got Saudi Aramco with a major presence downtown. The company sponsors the Houston Half Marathon, for instance. But increasingly, we view Saudi Arabia as a rival, as an oil market rival, as oil production in the U.S. has grown so much. So Saudi Arabia is equal parts fascinating and misunderstood. It's one of the only countries never to have been fully colonized, and the only country named after the family that currently rules it. So today we are going to discuss one of the more prominent members of that family, the Al Saud family, whose name adorns the kingdom. And we'll talk about Saudi Arabia and its domestic politics, its leadership, the kingdom's role in the world, and its relationship with the United States. So the Saudi kingdom has really never been an easy place for Westerners to penetrate and explain. So we are extremely fortunate today to have Ben Hubbard with us, the New York Times Beirut bureau chief, who spent more than a dozen years reporting on the Middle East, along with various long stints in Saudi Arabia. So before becoming a journalist, Ben studied history in Chicago. He studied Arabic in Cairo and journalism at Berkeley, served as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa. He is a native of Colorado, and he lives with his wife in Beirut, from where he joins us live and direct. Ben's new book, MBS, The Rise to Power of Mohammed bin Salman, is the reason he's here today. So the book gives an admirably balanced portrait, I think, of the young crown prince, leveraging in-depth reporting and detailed points of view of ordinary Saudis and elites. I can assure you it's an excellent review, excellent read, and I thoroughly recommend it. So let's listen to Ben introduce the book, and then we'll follow up with some Q&A. Please post short questions via Zoom, and then we'll collate those and get them to Ben. So Ben, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much for having me. Nice to talk to Houston. Not a part of the country I know very well, so it'd be good to just hear kind of what your reflections are, and I'm very, very much looking forward to the questions. First, just to give kind of a broad overview, I want you to sort of go back in time to 2014. So 6 years ago, Saudi Arabia was a very different place than it is now. And so first, I want to just provide a picture of kind of what it looked like. I started going there in 2013. But if we move back to 2014, it was a very different place. Socially, it was very conservative. Women could not drive cars. They could not work in a wide range of professions. Things like art and music were frowned upon, and people who were into these things tend to keep them, do it in the privacy of their own homes, but they were not sort of things that you were going to talk about being involved in public very much. That was because Saudi Arabia followed one of the most conservative interpretations of Islam around. And, this was the official state religion taught in the schools, taught in the universities, and also considerable effort was put out by the government and by other associations with the government to export this abroad, Wahhabism, for those of you who, follow the term. And inside of Saudi, it was an absolute monarchy. Saudis had, I would say, a somewhat limited ability to express themselves and discuss their society and politics on social media. There was this new outlet around called Twitter, which you may have heard of. It's a very big deal in Saudi Arabia. Lots of people were on it, and they were discussing things. And there was a certain margin that people had to, even to a certain extent, criticize some government policies or talk about things that were happening in society. Politically, it was ruled by an elderly king, one of the sons of the king who founded the kingdom in 1932. The Saudi military, despite having spent many tens of billions of dollars on weapons, from the United States, the UK, and other countries, had never been involved in a significant war. The country was more or less ruled by kind of a council of senior princes, not an official body. Officially, it's ruled by the king, but below the king, you had kind of this group of senior princes who would run the different portfolios. So you would have one prince and kind of his branch of family who would handle foreign affairs, somebody else in charge of the National Guard, someone else in charge of the military. And, they would sort of get together and discuss things. And, there was sort of a consensus model for how the kingdom that was run. And this ended up meaning that policy making in Saudi Arabia was a very slow process. And the word that you often hear to describe it is glacial, because it took forever to get things done. And so Saudi Arabia was kind of a slow place. At that time, of course, President Obama was still in the White House, and he had a very complicated relationship with the Saudis. They were not particularly happy with a number of things that his administration had done. They didn't like the way that the Obama administration had handled the protest movements of the Arab Spring and how quickly they had turned on people like like President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. And they were especially not happy about the Iran deal and sort of the mass investment of political capital and effort that Obama and certainly John Kerry had put into working behind the scenes with the Iranians to reach this deal. Now, quickly, let's fast forward up to the present day. So now in 2020, how much changed? Saudi Arabia is a much, much different place than it was back in 2014, before Mohammed bin Salman came onto the scene. Many of the conservative clerics have been arrested, or they've been given very stern messages that they need to stop sort of stop putting out a lot of the very conservative and many people would say, sort of this font of intolerance that they used to be. The religious police, who used to be the on-the-ground enforcers of Wahhabism, who would sort of patrol public places and make sure that men and women who are not related were not mixing inappropriately or things like that, have been denied their ability to arrest anybody. So they still exist, but they don't have the power that they used to be. And social life as a result is very different. So now women can drive, any woman who's of age can go get a driver's license, buy a car, drive herself to work, drive herself wherever she wants. This is a massive change in society. Women can pursue jobs in a whole range of professions that either they could not before, or that it was looked down upon for them to pursue before. Arts, which were once looked down upon, are now encouraged. There was a recently the Saudis had announced they're going to start teaching arts and music in universities and schools, which is something that had not happened before. The kingdom is also saying that it's going to invest a lot of money in world-class museums. And, for the last few years, concerts, including by, lots of Western musicians. I mean, everybody from Yanni to the Backstreet Boys. And, they've been going to Saudi Arabia and holding these big concerts. These concerts became so common that journalists like me sort of stopped writing about them because they weren't sort of new and exciting anymore. Politically, Saudi Arabia has adopted a much more assertive posture in the region. Some would say aggressive. It's been involved in a 5-year war, 5-year military intervention in Yemen, which has turned into a quagmire, been incredibly destructive to Yemen and killed, sort of an uncounted number of people in Yemen. There have been various sort of efforts by Saudi Arabia to intervene in the politics of other Arab countries. Certainly Lebanon, there's a key example that we'll probably talk about, Iraq, and elsewhere. They see Iran as their biggest foe in the region. And so there's kind of a regional Cold War going on between Saudi and Iran that colors a lot of the other politics throughout the region. More recently, we've seen other assertive moves, obviously important to people in Houston, the recent oil price war with Russia, which significantly contributed at least to the crash of the global oil price. Inside the kingdom, there's a much smaller margin for expression than even Saudis would have had before. People have sort of learned that even stray comments on social media can get you in trouble. There have been a number of people who've been arrested for various kinds of, political activism or speaking out about various things. People can get arrested for just tweets that the government doesn't like. This whole campaign of cracking down on some dissent out, clearly peaked with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, which, I'm sure everybody is quite aware of. And, we can talk about some of the dynamics of that if that's interesting. But all of this has very much sent the message that if you don't like what the government is doing, then you should probably keep your mouth shut or you might get in trouble. One of the most surprising things that's happened is that the Saudi leadership has an incredibly close relationship with President Trump. I think this is something that very few Saudi watchers would have expected before, certainly when Trump won the election. And so we can talk about that. And that's become a major factor in what Saudi Arabia is doing and in Saudi Arabia's relationship with the United States. And instead of being run by this kind of council of senior princes, most of those princes have been either removed from power or cut down to size in various other ways. And pretty much everything now comes back to the man I wrote my book about, Mohammed bin Salman, who is now the crown prince. His father is the king, but Mohammed bin Salman is very much the person with his hands on the levers of power in Saudi Arabia, who's really running the show. My book, I really tried to keep the focus very tight on Mohammed bin Salman, on who is this person. I've been covering the area, I've been in the Arab world for about a dozen years, and we just really, it's just very rare, certainly in this region or probably in any region, that you see this kind of a figure emerge. When he came onto the scene in 2015, most people had no idea who he was, including many people in the US government whose job it is to kind of keep track of who's up and coming inside of the Saudi royal family. And in this amount of time, since 2015, he's really managed to sort of eliminate a number of his rivals, restructure parts of the government to make sure that everything that's important in Saudi Arabia really reports back to him. And so I really wanted in my book to give a sense of who this person is, where he came from, and to try to answer the question of how did he do it? How did this one prince, and there are thousands of Saudi princes, how did this one prince manage to sort of step out of the crowd in 2015 and in a rather short period of time amass so much control and so much power? And then also try to look at, what exactly is he trying to do with it, both domestically and internationally. So with that, I just want to kind of give a broad introduction, and with that, we can move on to questions, just so we can focus on whatever people are most interested in.
All right. Well, why don't I, while the audience is sending, we've got a few coming in from them. Why don't I kick it off with a few questions? So Ben, how do you think that we in the United States should conceptualize MBS and his rise to power? I mean, there was, I think there was some hope here in the U.S., including from some of your colleagues on the op-ed side, that was kind of dashed, really, that when Khashoggi was murdered. So how do you think we ought to look at MBS, if it's possible to say that yet? I mean, is he another one of these in a long line of these Middle East strongmen who held promise as reformers initially, that maybe that some of that promise turned out to be a bit misplaced, or do you think he's really a true reformer who's got a vision, who's laying the groundwork for a new and very different Saudi Arabia, or something else?
I think there are really two overarching trends that we've seen with the rise of MBS since 2015. The first is this, that I do think that he does have a genuine desire to reform the kingdom, to make it a different place than it was before. And I think that this is on the social level, some of the things I talked about in my introduction. On the economic side, this is definitely a huge objective of him. I think he's talked about how Saudi Arabia is addicted to oil and needs to break this addiction. The way to do this, he says, is to diversify the economy, try to bring other sectors online, find ways to move employed Saudis away from the government and more into the private sector. They're talking about investing in, everything from mining to entertainment to tourism to all of these different sectors that they're hoping are going to start both employing Saudis and bringing money into the kingdom. And I don't, we can certainly have a discussion about the likelihood of his ability to pull these things off, to really succeed, and to what extent these things are really going to work. But I don't see any need to dismiss them as sort of PR or sort of a sales campaign. No, I think these are things that he genuinely wants to do. I think he genuinely wants Saudi Arabia to be a different place than it was when his father came to the throne. What we've seen, and I think this is the trend that you mentioned. Certainly, some of the early writing about MBS that was kind of breathless about this guy who came in and said, we want to get rid of extremism, and we want to be open to the world, and we want to give women more rights. There was a huge amount of enthusiasm about all of this early on, and I think this is the trend that people were paying attention to at the time. What we've become more aware of since then, I think, is the flip side of this, or I don't even know if it's the flip side, but I would say a parallel trend at least. Is a strict authoritarianism. As much as MBS has talked over the last number of years about economic reform, about social reform, he's never talked about political reform. This is not somebody who came in and said, I'm going to make it easier for Saudis, for individual Saudi citizens to play a role in who governs them or how they're governed. And it's actually been the opposite. He's made it quite clear that he does not want citizens to go out and criticize things that the government is doing. There's been multiple cases of either activists leading campaigns on social media for things that they would have liked to see change, ending up getting arrested. Some of them are still on trial. Some of them are still in jail. Some of them have just, basically gotten the message that they need to be quiet or they're going to end up in trouble. And so they've kind of faded away. There've been much more, I think a level up from that, there've been much more assertive efforts to go after people that the Saudis consider legitimate dissidents. Some of this has reached abroad. There's been phone hacking scandals. There's been, and then obviously this all culminated with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, somebody who had for most of his life been considered part of the establishment. I mean, he was sort of a government journalist who had advised princes, advised, Saudi ambassadors, and, very much was seen for most of his life was speaking for the kingdom, and then fallen out with MBS, moved to Washington, and was very critical of what Mohammed bin Salman was doing. So they killed him. This very much sent a message that, if you're not on board with the program and if you're going to go talk about it, then there's going to be a price to pay. And I think what's been tricky in the West is I think a lot of people in the West have, people assume that if you have social reform and economic reform, you're also going to have political reform. But I just don't think that's true. I think that these two things have existed simultaneously and they interact to a certain extent. And that if you look away from the West, there are plenty of examples of this model working perfectly fine. I mean, China's a fairly good example, a place that has, an economy that's boomed faster than any other economy in the history of humanity. And it's also a very authoritarian place. You can look at Singapore, the best example is probably the United Arab Emirates next door to Saudi Arabia, which has a very dynamic economy, is, certainly for the foreigners who live there, quite socially liberal, but at the same time is very authoritarian, not a place where there's an active media that's talking about what the government is up to or criticizing it or asking serious questions, and certainly not getting into the politics of its royals. So I think that's what I think people need to understand about Mohammed bin Salman. I think these two things exist simultaneously and have continued to sort of guide him throughout his rise. And I have every reason to believe that they will continue to guide him into the future. I think the question is really what the balance is going to be between those two things. How much are we going to see the reformer and how much are we going to see the authoritarian?
Sometimes I think they work in hand. I mean, if you open up socially and you expand social freedoms, it's sort of, you can bring some folks on board, and even as you're taking away maybe some of their political opportunities with the other hand, right? So sort of levers that maybe he's operating to, but so do you see him favoring one demographic group over another? Is he trying to establish a political base with young Saudis? I mean, it seems like, last time I was there, that seemed to be the case. I mean, the folks I spoke to seemed to be pretty enamored of him for the most part, younger Saudis. And then you have his actions in the, locking up prominent Saudis who come from, had pretty strong power bases of their own, in the Ritz-Carlton for so long. And then, as you mentioned, hardline clerics and even outspoken folks, even sometimes folks who are supportive of the government on Twitter, but were maybe just too open for one of the ones you mentioned in your book, Issam al-Zamal, locked up, I think still, who's sometimes
he's on trial for terrorism.
I mean, amazing.
He was an economist and entrepreneur who wrote a series of tweets questioning the wisdom of the Aramco IPO, of IPOing Aramco, basically saying, is this what we want to do with our economic crown jewel? And they arrested him, and now he's on trial for terrorism charges, which I think most people outside of Saudi Arabia just think is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, including me. I mean, it seems absurd. I mean, his, prior to that series of tweets, he was basically trying to bring Saudis along with the subsidy reform, the reform of the energy subsidies that I wrote about. So he was somebody I quoted in my book as a who was actually backing MBS's some of his reforms on this. So I guess what I'm getting at is do you see him currying favor with a certain demographic and sort of using that as a foil maybe to repress others, or is this part of him sort of amassing power ahead of accession, or is this a part of this change in the social contract that you're talking about?
Well, he definitely has his constituencies inside of Saudi Arabia. There's no doubt about that. I mean, before he came onto the scene, I mean, there had been a struggle inside of Saudi Arabia between, I mean, I think in the Saudi context, you can see them as liberals and conservatives. That it's not exactly the same way we would use those terms in the United States, but I think in the Saudi context, you had the conservatives who were, quote unquote, the Wahhabis, the people who really felt that what Saudi Arabia does right is very, very conservative Islam. We need to be a lighthouse to the Muslim world. We need to show them the way that it's done. And this means we don't let women drive. We don't have movie theaters. We don't have concerts. We don't sort of do all these other things that we think Islam doesn't allow. And then you had, I would say, in the Saudi context, the liberals. And these were, people, many of them also very devout Muslims, but who just said, that's going too far. There's no reason that we can't be good Muslims and have movie theaters and allow women to drive. Every other Muslim country in the world does it. So like, what's the big deal? And there had been a constant sort of struggle between these two sides in Saudi Arabia to get, either, just sort of push the government a bit more in their direction, get a concession here or there. MBS's rise has very much been a win for the liberals. I mean, for the people who wanted Saudi Arabia to kind of open up more to the world, to change socially, to bring in music and movie theaters and entertainment, change the status of women. It's been a huge win for them. And so the people who were kind of invested in seeing those changes coming about, they're very happy with what's going on. I mean, this is what they had wanted to see. The demographics are very important, I think, in understanding this. Saudi Arabia is, I think it's roughly 30 million people, about 22 million citizens. The rest are foreign workers. But of the 22 million citizens, about 2/3 of them are under age 30. So it's a very young country demographically. And because of, basically because of the internet, these young Saudis are very well connected to the rest of the world. Many of them carry multiple cell phones and they have 3 or 4 accounts on Twitter. And for a while, perhaps still today, they were the world's highest consumers of YouTube per capita of any country in the world. And so they were connected to the world outside of Saudi Arabia in a way that older Saudis were not. And they could see the way that, what was happening in the West. A lot of them were probably watching the same stuff on Netflix that many of you watch. The more conservative ones no longer had to just rely on the local Saudi clerics. They could go, listen to Saudi clerics from other Muslim countries who probably had different perspectives from, Egypt or, any other country. And so there was very much a change there. And so I think that that's a group that I think is a large part of MBS's kind of demographic base or his political base. He's also done, I would say, some smart politics inside the royal family. I mean, a lot of the older senior princes have been cut out, and that has created a lot of anger. Mohammed bin Nayef, who was the crown prince and was ran the interior ministry, which oversaw the police forces and the security services, was put under house arrest after he was removed and has, more recently been arrested. And huge anger over that, certainly in people who are connected to him. Many of the other princes who were kind of that level have been shoved aside because they were sort of seen as being a threat to MBS. And so there's a lot of anger there. What's received less attention, I think, is some of the smarter politics that MBS has done domestically. He's brought in a number of younger princes of his generation and placed them in various places. So you've seen, a number of the younger princes kind of come in from different branches of the family and be named, deputy minister this, deputy governor of such and such province. And I think this is a way of kind of letting the broader royal family know that, okay, some of these older figures have been cut out, but your particular branch of the family still has a stake, in the way that the place is run. The only caveat I would put on all of this is that, people always ask me sort of how popular is he? How popular is he in Saudi Arabia? And it's hard for me to tell, even anecdotally, because I haven't been able to get to Saudi Arabia since 2018. I haven't been able to get a visa since mid-2018. So I can't even go in and sort of, talk to people offline and try to figure out how they're seeing things. And Saudi Arabia is a very closed place. I mean, it's a very closed society. It basically has no effective civil society. There's almost no reliable political opinion polling. And people sometimes don't like it when I say this, but it also just doesn't matter that much how popular he is. It's an absolute monarchy at the end of the day. It's not like he's ever going to have to run in the, primary against somebody else as crown prince to see who gets to be king or anything like that. Unless people get so angry that there's some kind of an uprising. The people in Saudi, average Saudis don't have a lot of ways to push back against the way that they're being ruled. And he's also made it very clear, as I talked about in the introduction, that if you like what's going on, if you're a fan of the reforms, if you like the way that the country is going, you're more than welcome to go on social media and talk about all this great stuff that's happening and how happy you are. But if you don't really want to pay taxes and you think that IPOing Aramco is a bad idea and you're worried about this, or you don't like the fact that they've been spending huge amounts of money in a quagmire in Yemen, you should, most Saudis realize you should keep that to yourself, because you could get arrested for being too vocal about that. So I think it's hard to know exactly, it's very hard to really get a gauge of popularity, and it's probably not as important as we tend to think it is in the West.
Yeah, there's actually this political thinking. There's a concept called the dictator's dilemma, where the more an authoritarian engages in repression, the less he knows about his society, because the less anybody wants to say about him. So the more paranoid that ruler gets, and the more repressive he gets. So so it's if you go too far down that repression route, you'll have less and less information about the society around you. I guess I wanted to switch gears a little bit and maybe look at, you wrote about and a lot about the Trump administration's approach to Saudi Arabia, which is really interesting. You mentioned it briefly in your opening remarks, but Trump traveling to Saudi Arabia in his first overseas trip, kind of changing precedent. And really, a huge surprise, right? I mean, he hadn't spoken too warmly about the Saudis during his campaign. And then here he is with, billboards, along the roads in Riyadh, and a full-on red carpet welcome. And, all of a sudden MBS is his best buddy. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about U.S. interests and, and Trump's effect. Has he helped MBS in his rise? I mean, do we pick favorites? He wasn't the crown prince initially, and he became the crown prince. So has Trump been kind of helpful to MBS's program? Has he perhaps set any dangerous precedents that that a future president is going to have to unwind or may want to unwind? I don't know if you could maybe dig a little bit into that.
Yeah, I think again, it's interesting to sort of do a before and after. I mean, if you go back to the campaign, I have a section in the book where I sort of pull together a bunch of the things that Donald Trump had said both about Muslims and about Saudi Arabia, and it's all incredibly negative. I mean, Donald Trump was not shy about sort of assuming that Muslims were terrorists. He had said a number of nasty things about Saudi Arabia, including during one of the debates against Hillary Clinton, where he sort of uses the fact that the Clinton Foundation had received money from Gulf countries as a way of criticizing her during the debate, and basically saying, you're in the pocket of the Saudis. Who are you to talk to? But there was, by the time he won the election, there was almost no reason to believe that he was going to have a good relationship with these people. And I actually think, looking back with hindsight, it's one of the most remarkable things that the Saudis have done in the last number of years, is the fact that they were able to sort of overcome that and build a strong relationship with the Trump administration. Talk a little bit about that, and we can get to kind of what the effects are. What they did, they did a number of things. They sent a delegation to the East Coast soon after the election. I think there was kind of a panic in governments across the world of who is this guy and how are we going to engage with them. The Saudis were in the same boat. They knew Hillary Clinton. All of a sudden they have to deal with Donald Trump. They don't have relationships there. So they sent a delegation, sort of a fact-finding mission about the incoming administration, to figure out who are these people. So they went and they did a bunch of interviews and meetings. They met some of Trump's business associates. They went to New York. They went to DC. They met some people from some Republicans who had contact with Trump. They met with Jared Kushner, and they wrote up a report for the royal court, kind of diagnosing, or that's the wrong word, profiling the incoming administration. And the conclusions that they came to turned out to be very correct. They said this is not a group of professional politicians. These are people who don't really know, these are business people. They're deal makers. They're interested in the bottom line. They don't really know much about the Middle East or Saudi Arabia. What they do know about the Middle East is basically all about Israel. And this report was sort of used to craft the Saudi approach to Trump. They basically figured out what they needed to do to appeal to him. And it ended up being remarkably successful, so successful that, Trump decided, instead of visiting one of the closest US allies, which is what every other American president has done with his first foreign trip, he decides to go to Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis are, they're overjoyed. And that lays the groundwork for this relationship that we've seen over the last, 3.5 years. It's just been quite remarkable. And in terms of the effects there, it's really, the Trump administration has really been a firewall for Mohammed bin Salman and a lot of the things that he has done that have caused anger in the United States. Different initiatives that he's had have really ticked off people in different parts of the US government. So, the war in Yemen, people in the Pentagon didn't like it. They were not given a lot of, not that the US was necessarily involved in it, but the United States has been training Saudi pilots. We've been sending, selling them weapons, selling them bombs, training them how to use the bombs, training the pilots. Saudi officers often come to the United States for military training. There's a very close relationship there that I don't think a lot of people know about. And so it was quite hard, I think, for professional American military people to sit back and say, wow, these people, this military that we've been working on is now like bombing weddings and funerals and killing huge numbers of civilians. And, it wasn't something that the US wanted to get too close to. So, that caused a lot of sort of frustration in the Pentagon. The way that Mohammed bin Salman ended up treating Mohammed bin Nayef, he was the security chief of Saudi Arabia. He was the primary player in the kingdom's war against Al Qaeda during the 2000s, and had a very close relationship with the CIA, including a succession of its heads. John Brennan considered him a close friend, and so putting Mohammed bin Nayef under house arrest angered a lot of people in the intelligence services and in the security services. You look at what happened in Lebanon, where they basically kidnapped Saad Hariri from the prime minister of Lebanon, forced him to resign as a way to try to change the internal politics of Lebanon. There were certainly a lot of people in the State Department who were pretty uncomfortable with how that went down. Anyway, and then of course Khashoggi, that ticked everybody off. I mean, that of course there was just sort of outrage in both bipartisan outrage in both houses of Congress. Everybody was sort of angry about that. Throughout all of these various events, Donald Trump stood up for Mohammed bin Salman. His main message was that our relationship with the Saudis is incredibly important. These people are central to our Middle East policy, to the things that we want to do, and they buy a lot of weapons. And this was repeatedly what Trump said after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, when he was, I think when Trump was under a lot of pressure to kind of take a line on the Saudis and on the future of that relationship. And so it's really given MBS a huge cushion in doing a lot of these things, and I think has protected him from some of the blowback that he could have received from other parts of the United States government. Now, I really don't want to get into fortune telling, but the question right now, obviously, is, well, what's going to happen in November? I'm not going to speculate about what's going to happen in November, but I think it is safe to assume that if Trump wins another 4 years, it's going to very likely give him much more leeway. I mean, we haven't really seen any sign of Trump tempering his relationship with the Saudis. The closest was probably during the oil war, which I think for Trump, when you hit the NASDAQ and you hit the oil industry, like this is, a lot of his friends are going to be angered by that. But we did not see Trump kind of come out, very vocally and criticize the Saudis for what was going on there. And so I don't, so far we don't have a lot of indications that Trump would adopt a different posture towards the Saudis in a second term. What a Biden administration would do with the Saudis, I don't know. It's very hard to predict. I do think it's quite unlikely, given some of the language coming out of the campaign, and I think some of the language that Biden has used historically, that I don't think he's going to want to have a buddy-buddy relationship with Mohammed bin Salman. I think it's quite difficult to imagine a Democratic president anytime soon inviting Mohammed bin Salman into the Oval Office for a photo op. And I just think it's going to be quite hard to do because of the domestic optics, and because, Mohammed bin Salman is not seen right now in the United States as somebody that you want to be particularly close to. So we'll have to, of course, wait and see what happens in November and how it plays out. But the Trump administration has been a key factor in a lot of what MBS has been able to do, and we'll just have to watch how that progresses going forward.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, along those lines, one more from me, and then I'll start reading some of the audience questions here. But some of the oil state Republicans, including a group of senators, threatened during that Saudi-Russian oil war, after this sort of coronavirus outbreak, basically to take action against Saudi Arabia, up to and including withdrawing U.S. troops, retracting our security umbrella, taking a long, hard look at this a really close U.S.-Saudi relationship. I mean, I think the Trump administration wasn't having any of it really, but maybe it was a sort of a good cop, bad cop approach, and the Saudis quickly backed down off of that oil price war. But do you have any thoughts about how highly MBS values his strategic relationship and the hard security protection that the U.S. provides, and what he might do if that relationship soured? Is there a plan B? Is there another option?
I mean, I think I think Mohammed bin Salman has made it quite clear that he sees the U.S. both as, the kingdom's most important security partner, but also as a role model. I think culturally, in a lot of ways, he sees it as a role model. I mean, this is somebody who grew up, watching American cartoons and American television and movies. And he has a tremendous fondness for American culture. I would say, if you draw the line around the political democracy side of things and sort of put it aside. But, this is somebody that before, when he was deputy crown prince, and so second in line to the throne, he took a trip to Silicon Valley because he wanted to go meet the greats of Silicon Valley. And he went and he met Mark Zuckerberg and tried on a VR headset. And he took another remarkable trip in 2018 when he was crown prince, where he met everybody. I mean, he spent a number of weeks traveling. I think he visited 5 states, the District of Columbia. He had coffee with Mike Bloomberg at a Starbucks in Manhattan. He met Oprah. He met Bill Gates in Seattle. He went to the Google campus. He saw Mark Zuckerberg again. He met Jeff Bezos. Then he goes to Hollywood and he meets, Rupert Murdoch and all these Hollywood people. And, this was a massive investment in the relationship with the United States, and not just the DC side of things, not just the security, military, economics, oil. But I think that these were sectors of the American economy that he felt Saudi Arabia could benefit from having a strong relationship with. A lot of that, I think, went away after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, because a lot of these people who didn't already have a relationship with Saudi Arabia were going to think twice about getting very involved with it, because there was a new reputational cost to it that didn't exist before. Where it goes in the future, I don't know. I mean, one of the arguments that Donald Trump has made has always been that if we don't sell weapons to the Saudis, then they're just going to go buy them from the Russians. It's possible, I guess, but it's not that easy. It's not like buying a car where sort of you buy a Volvo and then you decide you don't like the Swedes, and so then you go buy a Toyota. When you buy this quantity of weapons and things that are this high, you can't just flip the switch and turn it off, because these things come with long-term maintenance contracts. They come with servicing contracts. They come with training contracts, and these are long-term contracts for buying all of this kit, keeping it supplied, and so you can't just sort of suddenly convert an American purchased Air Force into a Russian purchased Air Force. So even if there were to somehow be a bigger breakdown in the U.S.-Saudi relationship, it would be just logistically very difficult for the Saudis just to turn off the American relationship and sort of turn it on with somebody else. There are ways that they could gradually diversify what they have, and I think politically, at least, we've seen some efforts to do that. I mean, early, King Salman took a trip to Russia and met Putin, which was the first time that the Saudi monarch had, done that perhaps ever. I'd have to look and check, but certainly in many, many decades. MBS has taken, I think, a handful of trips to China to try to build relationships there. Saudis are very interested in their relationship with Pakistan, with India. And so there has been, some effort on the political side to kind of diversify some of the alliances. But Saudi Arabia has been so close to the United States for so long on so many levels that it's not, you can't just flip the switch and turn it off.
Okay, well, so let me go to some of the questions. We've got a whole bunch of them here. Let me start with one of my colleagues, Francisco Monaldi. He's asking here, how could the current economic crisis affect support for the monarchy, MBS, and his succession to the throne? Is there relevant dissidence inside the royal family? I mean, we know there's so many other of the sort of third generation the grandsons of Ibn Saud So how do you see any kind of threat building?
Yeah, it's
plausibly?
it's very hard to tell. I don't want to speculate on it too much. I mean, the economic crisis is definitely not good for MBS, but it's not. He didn't bring it on, So I don't know if he's gonna, could it make him more vulnerable in certain ways? Maybe, but I don't think it's not like the economic issue is his fault. It's not his fault that the oil, I mean, I guess the oil price war, but the decline of global prices since 2014 is certainly not his fault. And that's where the Saudis' original kind of budget pressure came from. And then obviously coronavirus, well, it's causing economic crises all across the globe. So that's not necessarily his fault. And it's probably not as bad in Saudi Arabia as it is in other places. I guess it's possible that could turn into some more pressure on him. In terms of, kind of, pressures inside the royal family, there are definitely rivalry. There's definitely rivalry inside the royal family. There are definitely princes who are not happy with the way that this has gone. People who felt that they should have had a shot, who felt that they were better qualified, or who felt that, or who are not happy with the way that this has gone, who just feel that, MBS, by some of the things that I've mentioned, has not done a good job of leading the kingdom, and that he's dangerous, and that he's going to squander the crown jewel of Aramco and things like that. There's definitely a lot of people who feel that. But the question is really who has the ability to do anything about it. And, Saudi Arabia is a very opaque place. There could always be things happening under the surface that are not quite clear. But from where I sit, I just have a hard time seeing any of these other princes really having logistically what they would need to mount a challenge. It used to be that you had a certain number of princes. You had a prince who was in charge of the National Guard, which is a standing military force inside the kingdom. You used to have, the defense minister. You had the interior minister, obviously, which ran the secret police forces and the regular police forces. And all of those posts have been co-opted, and now they're all held by younger princes who are very much under Mohammed bin Salman. So, I just don't see how any of these angry princes, other than sort of complaining when they get a chance in private settings or perhaps to foreign journalists, it's just very hard to see how they're going to mount an official challenge to, the actual control that Mohammed bin Salman has over the country right now. There could be interesting dynamics when MBS's father dies. I mean, King Salman is one of the youngest surviving sons of the founder of Saudi Arabia. So this is a man with tremendous status inside the family, very, very well respected. He ran he was the governor of Riyadh for almost 50 years. So so I think that even people who don't like what MBS is doing may have kind of bitten their tongues so far, just out of deference for the king. This is the king's son, and we don't want to rock the boat. We're a monarchy at the end of the day, and when King Salman passes away, that might be the last opportunity for people who are not happy about the rise of MBS to do something about it. But still, from where I sit, it's very hard to see who's going to be able to marshal the necessary kind of resources to pose a real challenge.
Yeah, interesting. Well, quite a few questions coming in on the Jamal Khashoggi killing, and you've touched on that already. We've got quite a few questions asking various things about this, but maybe if you could just talk about how it has complicated things for MBS internationally, maybe domestically as well, but his international standing, his goals. Is this something he's gotten past yet, or is it going to affect him? I don't know. How's it made things more difficult for him?
Well, domestically, I think the question is easily. I don't think it's probably had much effect. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people inside of Saudi Arabia who are angry that it happened, who feel that it made the kingdom look bad, that it's, but I, again, I don't think that sort of gives them real ammunition that they can use against MBS, or sort of ammunition is the wrong word. I don't want to imply that, but yeah, domestically, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are really angry that this happened because it's sort of a black mark on the kingdom. But I don't know sort of what effect that's going to have on MBS domestically. Internationally is obviously a much more interesting question. And I think part of the answer goes back to this remarkable, there was actually 2 trips that MBS took in early 2018. First, he went to the UK, where he was, received like a royalty, as I guess he should have been. But, he met the heads of MI5, MI6. He met parliamentary delegations, the prime minister, and he met Queen Elizabeth. There's a photo that you can find of sort of MBS, who's a quite large man towering over the British monarch. And then he took his trip to the US that I mentioned just a minute ago. Which, when you think about it, who else could have flown to the United States and spent 4 weeks traveling around and gotten time with all of those people? I mean, it was just a really remarkable trip when you look at kind of, I think in the book I write about it as almost this amazing tour of American hard and soft power. I mean, the fact that he was able to get time and sit down with, everybody from Oprah Winfrey to Jeff Bezos to, you know, much of that wasn't, I would say, actualized in that, and these people were curious about this guy. I think they had heard, okay, there's this new prince in Saudi Arabia who wants to change things. It's obviously a country that has a lot of money. Maybe there's investment or business opportunities. Like, sure, let's clear a few hours and let's see this guy. I mean, how often does a crown prince come to town? There were very few actual deals that resulted. I think the Saudis had hoped that there would be investment deals and sort of, cooperation agreements and things like that. There were very few concrete deals that came out of it, but there was a genuine sense of enthusiasm. There were a lot of people who had probably never thought much about Saudi Arabia before, who had thought, wow, this seems like an interesting person who's doing interesting things in this country that's important and that has a lot of money. And let's kind of see where this goes. And I think once once the murder of Jamal Khashoggi became clear, and once kind of the gruesomeness of this murder, just to give people a quick recap, I mean, he was, a Saudi journalist who was going to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul to get a piece of paper he needed in order to marry his Turkish fiance. He was met by a team of 15 Saudi agents who killed him and then dismembered him, and they made his body disappear. And then the Saudis spent a number of weeks basically lying about what happened before the Turks, put out all the information that they have and revealed what had happened. So it was just a devastating event for Saudi Arabia's international reputation, both because they did it and that they did it in such a gruesome way, and then also the way that they tried to cover it up, and that they just, numbers of Saudi officials just lied repeatedly about what had happened up until they basically didn't have any choice to come clean. So I think, when we look at sort of what was the cost of that to MBS, I think people who expected that, King Salman would remove MBS because this was such a bad thing, I don't think that was ever really in the cards, or that, other members of the family would get together and push MBS out. I don't think that was much of a possibility for the reasons I just talked about, that I don't think, they just didn't really have the power to make that happen. I think that the bigger cost of it for Saudi, and I also don't think that, MBS he's not going to go on trial for this somewhere for having, overseen this thing or had his agents do it. But I think it's very much a black mark and kind of a stain on the kingdom and on MBS's reputation, that it's going to make it much, much harder to do the things that he dreamt of doing. I mean, I think when he took that trip to the US, he was hoping that these relationships would last and that they would lead to agreements. And he was hoping that some of these companies, that Saudi companies would be able to work with people in Hollywood to create a Saudi indigenous entertainment industry. That's going to be really difficult. I don't think Rupert Murdoch is probably going to want to, get on a plane and fly to Saudi Arabia anytime soon, whereas he may have entertained that before. Jeff Bezos certainly is not interested in sort of, open business agreements with Saudi Arabia. Bloomberg, all of these people, I think that there's a reputational cost that now comes with doing business with Saudi Arabia that wasn't there before. And so I think when it comes to these new sectors that Saudi had hoped to get into, it's going to be much more difficult for them to get partners on board. I'm sure they'll find people, the weapons and the oil industry, those relationships are established. And I think Jamal Khashoggi was kind of a blip on that screen. But I think for kind of these new things that Saudi Arabia was hoping to get into, there's going to be a drag there just because of the reputational baggage.
And that drag may be enhanced now with the coronavirus, right? I mean, it's another question that I can maybe segue into, but the National Transformation Plan, the Vision 2030 plan, all were about diversifying the economy, to get beyond oil. I mean, I don't think, from my look at it, Saudi Arabia, they want to be the guys that produce and export the last drop of oil. That's until the last time, till the end of the oil age. However, they see climate action coming down the road here. They understand that peak demand is probably going to cut when we hit peak demand for oil, which there's a few folks speculating that we may have already hit it. As demand for oil drops, we'll see oil prices drop, and Saudi government spending is going to be affected by that. So do you see maybe MBS gotten himself maybe in a tougher spot than he may have otherwise been in, with some partners maybe pulling out investment. But what about the coronavirus, and how does that affect some of these aspirations that Mohammed bin Salman has been putting out? Have you seen much progress towards some of these economic goals that you wrote about?
Well, I mean, I think, we shouldn't, obviously we can't blame the coronavirus on Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, the drag that we talked about because of because of Jamal Khashoggi is very different from the impact of the coronavirus. I mean, coronavirus, in insurance terms, it's sort of an act of God. Nobody could have saw it coming. It's not MBS's fault. There was, I would say, modest. So to get back to the reform program, it was incredibly ambitious. And I think that sort of most outside analysts would say it was completely unrealistic. It was very idealistic about what they were going to do. Just one easy example. I mean, MBS said in an interview, it was, I guess, 2016, he said that by 2020, Saudi Arabia would be able to live without oil. I mean, wow, Okay, well, that obviously didn't happen. And there was no way that was ever going to happen. I think that was something that sounded very good at the time, but, it was just completely unrealistic. There are other things in the plan that they've, I think, made some small progress on. I mean, there's obviously, when you're a country like Saudi Arabia and nearly your entire economy is based on oil, there's a lot of work to be done if you want to diversify. And definitely, the coronavirus crisis is going to make it much more difficult. If the whole idea was, they're going to invest in tourism, they're going to invest in entertainment, they're going to invest in, I mean, these are all sectors that involve bringing large groups of people and putting them in the same place. So that's obviously going to be very difficult with the coronavirus, or they involve international travel, which is also not happening. So, coronavirus is going to hit everybody everywhere in the world. It's certainly hitting the U.S. economy, as we've seen from all the recent unemployment filings. And it'll definitely be a blow to Mohammed bin Salman as well, just in his ability he just doesn't have as much money and as much flexibility with the finances as he had wished that he had to sort of invest in these new sectors.
All right. So we've some questions on regional relationships. Well, 4 countries are popping up in these questions. So there seems to be a Saudi animus, growing Saudi animus towards Qatar, and perhaps a heightened animus for Iran, right? So we've got a question. Can you explain the reasons for the Saudi animus against Iran? Is it just religious sectarianism, or is it about regional dominance? And then on the other hand, Israel and the UAE, the relationship you wrote about between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, and this improvement in relationship with Israel, seemingly. So maybe could you touch on those 4 relationships?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I mean, Qatar. Yeah, I mean, definitely the Saudis are angry at Qatar. In 2017, they got together with 3 other countries and they imposed a big boycott on the country and, tried to shut down, denied it the ability to use their airspace, expelled its people, expelled its diplomats, and, tried to, and they made a bunch of very broad accusations about Qatar supporting terrorism, about Qatar intervening in the politics of regional countries and things like that. And nobody else got on board with this. I think the Saudis had hoped that they could convince other countries in the world that Qatar was really this sort of evil demon in the region that needed to be punished, and nobody else really got on board with that. But that's, and there are various theories about sort of why Saudi Arabia is so angry at the Qataris. I mean, some of this has to do with just political differences. Saudi Arabia is a giant. Qatar is a tiny, tiny place. Whereas Qatar, I think, has used its resources, obviously its tremendous gas resources, to really punch above its weight class in the region. Al Jazeera is a big thing, which is the most watched Arab news network, and which played a big role in the Arab Spring, supporting protest movements and doing a lot of things that Saudi Arabia didn't like. Qatar, as well, as historically had a lot of relationships with the Islamist movements in the region, the political Islamists, Muslim Brotherhood, and sort of all kinds of political activity in the region that the Saudis don't like. So all of that kind of fed into the boycott. And, this far in, there doesn't appear to be any kind of, sort of reconciliation in the offing here. There have been various points where Trump administration has got involved. I think is something that the Trump administration doesn't really like. They do think that it makes things more complicated for U.S. policy in the region. when these two countries that both, that are both the American partners in the region don't like each other and don't talk to each other. It's a headache for the US, but no, that there hasn't been much progress. And so I think that's likely to remain kind of part of the architecture of the region, is just a standoff between, Saudi Arabia, UAE, its partners, and Qatar on the other side. Iran, Iran, there's a long-standing rivalry with Iran, and I think this is somewhat, it's religious, it's ideological, it's political. Iran just basically stands for the opposite things that Saudi Arabia stands for, and Saudi Arabia is the Sunni kingdom. Iran is the Shiite. Iran sees itself as, Iran also tries to see itself as the center of the Muslim world, and has this kind of revolutionary Shiite ideology that wants to export around the region. Politically, don't like each other. Religiously, don't like each other. Ideologically, don't like each other. And then the Saudis, they have very legitimate security concerns about Iran too. It's not just about ideology. Iran, despite having, I would say, many, many fewer resources than Saudi Arabia has been very savvy about how it is kind of built up resources around the region that allow it to protect power. And this has mainly been by, building relationships with, non-state actors, militia groups. You have Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, you have groups in Syria, groups in Iraq. And, these are groups that Iran has built relationships with that has allowed it to, extend its influence over a much larger part of the Middle East than it would have kind of without all of these relationships. And this is something that makes the Saudis very nervous. They don't really want to have Iran involved in all of these Arab countries that in a certain sense kind of surround Saudi Arabia. And the danger of this was very much hit home last, I guess, August it was, when you had this attack on some of the Aramco facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia. It was, suddenly these drone and cruise missile attacks that came out of nowhere that took, massive oil processing facilities offline. Quite clear that the Iranians were behind it. I think, everybody sort of recognized that right away. And that really hit home kind of the danger to Saudi Arabia that, Iran, which has a much smaller economy, is seen by much of the, as kind of an international pariah, has been under sanctions. The fact that it could still really hit Saudi Arabia where it hurt, I think very much hit home kind of the threat there. And so, the Saudis have gone back and forth between sometimes very belligerent rhetoric about Iran, and we're going to do this and we're going to do this. And then I think after that, we saw a bit more kind of diplomacy of, Mohammed bin Salman being a bit more creative about, like, what can we do behind the scenes to try to bring down the temperature, because we don't really want a war. We don't want this to get out of hand, and we don't want to have an outright confrontation. So what can we do there? That's a relationship that's gonna, they're gonna kind of have to continue to manage, or a rivalry they'll have to continue to manage. UAE, it's quite straightforward. The UAE is much smaller than Saudi Arabia, and like these other smaller Gulf countries, they all kind of have to deal with Saudi Arabia because it's the giant in their region. I think early in the Mohammed bin Salman days, there was tremendous enthusiasm about him and the leadership of the UAE. Many of the UAE leaders had looked to Saudi Arabia as kind of this kind of a dinosaur, this place that has these clerics who, put out these crazy fatwas about, you can read in the WikiLeaks, Emirati leaders, joking about Saudi Arabia full of these clerics who think the earth is flat and things like that. And, the UAE kind of, secretly looked down on Saudi Arabia for being this way, but could never talk about it because Saudi Arabia is a giant and you have to deal with it if you're in the region. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for MBS in the early days. This was somebody who wanted to change a lot of the Wahhabism, somebody who wanted to be more open to the world, who seemed to have a worldview that was much closer to Mohammed bin Zayed, sort of the de facto leader in the UAE. Whether or not I think there's been some signs, the Emiratis would never tell you this, but I think there has been, I think that that excitement has been somewhat tempered by some of the things that Mohammed bin Salman has done that I think the UAE has kind of seen as a bit dangerous. But again, I think that, if you're the UAE and you're the small country next door to Saudi Arabia, it's a relationship that you need. It's a relationship that you have to manage. And I don't see it going away. Obviously it's going to be there. And the two countries still have a huge number of interests in common that they're going to work together on. Israel is the really interesting one. And that's the one that I think we've seen the most dynamism on. Saudi Arabia had always been, a key player in what used to be called the Arab consensus about Israel, which was that, Israel was a usurper in the region. We support the Palestinian cause. We support the creation of a Palestinian state. The Saudis had launched the Arab Peace Initiative, which was supposed to be the Arab proposal for how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Saudis went very far out of their way to never end up in the same room as Israelis. You never have Saudi leaders meeting Israelis, even at international summits and things like that. And what we've seen over the last few years, I mean, we should say right up front, this Saudi Arabia still does not have diplomatic relationships with Israel. Saudi leaders still have not met with Israeli leaders publicly, but there's been a discernible distance in tone in the way that the leadership and specifically MBS talk about Israel. MBS gave an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg at the Atlantic in 2018, where he said, the Israelis have the right to their land just like the Palestinians have a right to their land. And then he actually goes on to say, that I can imagine, we have a lot of shared interests in military stuff, economic stuff. And he sort of talks about Israel in a way that could see it as just another country in the region that has, economic ties and relationships. And this is something that previous Saudi leaders would have never talked about. In private contexts, we know that MBS has told various people that he doesn't consider Israel an enemy. Israelis are not killing Saudis, so why should we be so up about this? And there's just not much reason to believe that he personally has any sympathy for the Palestinians or for the Palestinian cause. He's much younger. He's too young to remember any of the Arab-Israeli wars. It's just not something that has a lot of emotional resonance for him, or I would say for a lot of his generation. On the flip side, I think he also sees Israel as, okay, this is a very tough nation in the region. They don't like Iran. They're probably the only nation in the region that hates Iran as much as we do. They have a very strong military. They have a very strong intelligence service. They also have a very strong tech sector. And so, I think MBS has recognized that there are things that the Israelis have done that, there could be overlapping interests there. This has kind of moved slowly. And, you hear various reports about covert meetings and things happening under the surface and whatever. And it has yet to really break out into the open, but the change in tone has been very, very significant. And I think it's a bit difficult to imagine it being put back in the box and us sort of going back to where we were before. That said, if, Netanyahu goes ahead with annexation, as many people think he's going to, that could be a very difficult thing for the Saudis to put up with. But, anyway, there has been a significant change in tone, and it's going to be very interesting to watch kind of how that develops going into the future.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, Ben. This has been super, super fascinating. You've given us a ton of great material, food for thought here for all of us to consider. I've been a big fan of your work, your reporting work for years. I think your book is a great read, thoroughly engaging, and really keep up the great work. I read you this morning in the paper, and hope to keep on reading your stuff. So you've been a real asset to the Times and all of us who are interested in the Middle East. So hope to see you again in person. And thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Great. Awesome. Well, that's it from us here at the Baker Institute. Thanks everybody for attending. Ben, have a great night in Beirut, and we'll talk to you soon.